I need to tell you something I've kept buried for 40 years. Something that changed everything I thought I knew about this world and my place in it. That winter night in the dead cold of the Appalachian Mountains, when the wind howled through the pines like something dying and the snow fell so thick you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. I heard a sound coming from my barn that didn't belong to any animal I'd ever known. It wasn't the cry of a wounded deer or the shriek of a mountain lion. It was something else entirely, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand straight up and my breath catch in my throat. I was 73 years old then, living alone. On land my family had worked for 5 generations, and I'd convinced myself I'd seen everything these mountains had to offer. I'd survived a war overseas, buried a wife and 2 sons, and learned to live with the kind of silence that most men can't endure. But that sound, that impossible sound cutting through the blizzard, it reached down into a part of me I thought had gone numb decades ago. I stood there in my kitchen, coffee cup frozen halfway to my lips, listening to something that shouldn't exist call out from the darkness. And despite every instinct screaming at me to bolt the door and pretend I'd heard nothing, I pulled on my coat and walked out into that killing cold. Because loneliness has a way of making you do unreasonable things. The barn door hung half open, banging against its frame in the wind, and the snow had already drifted halfway up the entrance. Inside, my old kerosene lamp threw wild shadows across the walls, and I could smell something sharp and unfamiliar cutting through the usual scent of hay and old wood. Something like ozone after lightning, mixed with copper and something sweet I couldn't name. My hands were shaking as I raised the lamp higher, and that's when I saw it, huddled in the far corner behind the empty horse stalls. At first, my mind tried to make sense of it, tried to reshape what I was seeing into something familiar. A person, maybe, or some exotic animal escaped from somewhere far away. But the longer I looked, the more that comfortable lie fell apart, because this thing breathing in ragged gasps on my barn floor was neither human nor animal, as I understood them. Its form was wrong in ways I still can't fully articulate, as if the laws of anatomy I'd always known were merely suggestions it had chosen not to follow. There was an intelligence in its eyes when they met mine, vast and ancient and absolutely terrified, and in that moment I understood that it was dying. I should have run, should have called someone, should have done anything other than what I did next, but I'd seen that kind of fear before, in the eyes of wounded soldiers far from home, and something in me, some stubborn, foolish part that refused to let another living thing die alone, made the decision before my rational mind could interfere. I moved slowly, the way you would approach a wild animal, keeping my hands visible and my voice low and steady. It flinched when I got close, pulling itself tighter into that corner, and I could see now that it was injured, badly, though the wounds themselves looked like nothing I'd ever encountered. There was no blood in the way I understood it, but something else, something that seemed to shimmer and fade in the lamplight, as if it couldn't quite decide whether to be liquid or light. I set the lamp down and backed away, then returned with blankets, water, and the first aid kit I kept for the animals I no longer owned. The creature watched every movement with those impossible eyes, and I could feel it measuring me, calculating whether I was a threat or perhaps something else entirely. When I finally got close enough to drape a blanket over its trembling form, it didn't pull away, and I took that as permission to stay. I talked to it the way I used to talk to my wife in her final days, just to fill the silence with something gentler than fear, though I had no idea if it could understand a single word. All through that endless night, I sat beside it in the freezing barn, feeding the small fire I'd built, watching its breathing slowly steady and wondering what in God's name I'd just invited into my life. When dawn finally broke and grey light filtered through the cracks in the barn walls, the creature was still alive, and I was still there beside it. I knew in that moment with a certainty that defied all logic and self-preservation that I wasn't going to tell anyone what I'd found. This thing, whatever it was, had somehow ended up in my barn, on my land, in my care, and the world outside these mountains, with all its questions and its governments and its need to control and categorize everything, couldn't be trusted with it. I'd spent my whole life following orders, doing what I was told, being the man everyone expected me to be, and where had that gotten me except alone on a mountain waiting to die? Maybe this was madness. Maybe I was just a foolish old man whose isolation had finally broken something essential in his mind. But as I watched this impossible being struggle for each breath, I made a promise to it and to myself. I would keep it safe, I would help it survive, and I would guard this secret with whatever time I had left. I had no way of knowing then that those months would turn into years, and those years into decades, or that this creature hiding in my barn would teach me more about what it means to be alive than all my years as a human being ever had. The first few weeks were an exercise in patience and instinct, a slow dance between two beings who had no shared language except fear and the fragile beginnings of trust. I brought it food, apples and potatoes at first, simple things from my root cellar, and watched as it examined each offering with a caution that bordered on reverence, as if every object from my world carried hidden dangers it had learned to respect. Sometimes it would eat, other times it would simply hold the food in those strange, elongated hands and seem to study it, and I began to understand that it wasn't just hungry, it was trying to comprehend the very nature of what I was offering. I started leaving paper and pencils in the barn, scattered among the blankets, like seeds waiting to take root. And one morning I found crude drawings scratched across the pages, circles within circles, lines connecting points in patterns that looked almost like constellations. My heart hammered in my chest as I realized what this meant. It could think abstractly, it could communicate, it could create. This wasn't some wounded animal I was sheltering. This was a mind attempting to reach across an impossible divide to touch mine. I began drawing too, simple things at first, a picture of myself, the barn, the mountains surrounding us, trying to establish a basic vocabulary of images we could both understand. The creature would study my drawings with an intensity that felt almost physical, then respond with its own, and slowly, painfully, slowly, we built a bridge between our worlds, made of charcoal and paper and desperate need. It drew itself, or at least I think it did, though the image looked more like light given temporary form than any solid thing. And beneath that image it drew what might have been a craft or a vessel, broken and incomplete. Then it drew the stars, dozens of them, hundreds, filling page after page with configurations I didn't recognize. And I understood it was trying to tell me where it came from. The distances involved made my mind real, made me feel smaller than I'd ever felt even in the vastness of these ancient mountains. And I sat there on the cold barn floor realizing that this being had traveled further than my entire species had ever dreamed. When it drew the earth, I recognized the continents, though they were positioned oddly, and then drew itself falling with jagged lines around it. Suggesting violence or accident, I felt something crack open inside my chest. Over those first months, I watched it slowly heal, watched whatever passed for its body knit itself back together through processes I couldn't begin to comprehend, and with physical healing came a growing comfort in my presence. It started moving around the barn when I was there, no longer cowering in corners, but observing me as I went about the simple tasks of keeping us both alive through that brutal winter. Sometimes I would catch it mimicking my movements, the way I walked, the way I picked things up, the gestures I made when I talked to myself out of long habit, and I realized it was learning not just my language, but my humanity, studying me the way a scholar studies an ancient text. There were moments when our eyes would meet across the dim space, and I would feel something pass between us. Not words exactly, but something deeper, a recognition that we were both exiles in our own way, both creatures far from whatever we had once called home. It told it about my sons, about my wife, about the war that still woke me screaming some nights, and though I don't know how much it understood, it listened with a stillness that felt like compassion. By the time spring came and the snow finally released its grip on the mountain, I had stopped thinking of it as a creature or a being and started thinking of it simply as a companion, someone whose presence had somehow filled the terrible silence I'd been drowning in for years. I brought it books, newspapers, anything with pictures and words, watching it absorb information with a hunger that seemed endless, its strange fingers tracing over photographs of cities and oceans and human faces. With something that looked like longing, or maybe sorrow. It drew more complex images now, scenes I couldn't quite pass, geometries that hurt to look at too long, and sometimes what appeared to be memories of places where the laws of physics bent in ways that made my stomach turn. But among these alien visions it also started drawing us, the two, of us sitting together in the barn. A simple image that carried more weight than all its cosmic diagrams, because it meant the creature understood what was happening between us, understood that despite everything that separated us, we had found in each other something neither of us had expected to find again, the possibility that we weren't quite as alone as we'd believed. The years folded into one another, like pages in a book I'd forgotten I was writing, each season marking not just the passage of time, but the deepening of something I had no name for, a connection that existed beyond language, beyond species, beyond anything I'd ever imagined possible in my long, lonely life. The being, I still had no other word for it, grew stronger, more substantial somehow, though its form remained that strange shimmer between solid and light. And with that strength came abilities that defied every law of nature I thought I understood. One autumn evening, as we sat together in the barn, the creature reached out one of those elongated hands and touched my forehead with a gentleness that made my breath catch, and suddenly I wasn't in the barn anymore. I was floating in a vast darkness punctuated by lights so brilliant they seemed to sing, stars arranged in patterns that felt somehow intentional, meaningful, like a language written across the void itself. The vision lasted only moments, but it felt like hours, and when I returned to myself I found tears streaming down my weathered face, my chest tight with an emotion too large and complex to name, something between grief and wonder and a longing for places I'd never been but somehow recognized. After that first vision, the creature began sharing more of its world with me, these brief windows into experiences so far beyond human comprehension that each one left me shaken and transformed. It showed me planets where light moved like water and time flowed in directions that shouldn't exist, civilizations that built their cities from sound and memory rather than stone and steel, life forms so different from anything on Earth that calling them alive seemed inadequate for what they were. But more than the alien wonders, it showed me loneliness. Its loneliness, an ache that spanned decades and light years, the specific pain of being the only one of your kind in a world that couldn't even perceive what you truly were. I understood then that we'd been speaking the same language, all along, the universal grammar of isolation, and that perhaps that's why it had trusted me in the first place. Because I carried that same weight in my eyes, that same resignation to young Yuan Ness without companion. My own solitude, which had once felt like a personal failure, suddenly became the bridge that allowed this impossible friendship to exist. And I found myself grateful for all those empty years, because they'd prepared me to recognize another exile when I met one. The being started spending more time outside the barn, moving through my property with a confidence that both pleased and frightened me, and I noticed it seemed particularly drawn to the oldest parts of the forest, places where the trees had stood for centuries and the land itself felt heavy with memory. I followed it one morning into a hollow I'd never explored despite living on this mountain for 40 years. And watched as it placed its hands against the trunk of a massive oak, its form pulsing with light that seemed to flow into the tree and back again in some a kind of exchange I couldn't fathom. The forest responded, I swear it did. The leaves rustling without wind, birds falling suddenly silent, a change in the air pressure that made my ears pop and my heart race. When the creature turned to me, I saw something in its expression that might have been joy or reverence, and it gestured wildly at the trees, at the earth, at everything around us, trying desperately to communicate something important. Through our improvised sign language and my growing intuition for its meanings, I slowly understood. It was telling me that Earth itself was alive in ways humans had forgotten or never known, that consciousness wasn't limited to beings like us, but threaded through everything, and that's why it had chosen to hide here, in these ancient mountains where the world still remembered how to speak. That revelation changed everything, made me see my own land with new eyes, and I began to understand that my companion wasn't just hiding on this mountain. It was communing with it, being held by it, maybe even healed by it in ways that went beyond the physical. I started finding it in different spots each day, always the oldest places, always where the boundary between civilization and wilderness felt thinnest. And I realized it was building relationships with this place the same way it had built one with me, slowly, carefully, through patient attention and wordless understanding. My role shifted from protector to witness, watching this cosmic being learn to love a single small corner of a planet it had spent centuries fearing, and in witnessing that transformation, I felt my own heart crack open in ways I'd thought were no longer possible. The loneliness that had defined my existence for so long began to ease, replaced not just by companionship, but by a sense of connection to something vast and ancient. A web of being that included me and the creature and these mountains and the stars it had shown me, all of us bound together in ways I was only beginning to perceive. The first time I tried to share the outside world. With my companion, I brought a small battery-powered radio into the barn, thinking perhaps it might enjoy music or find comfort in human voices, the way I sometimes did during the endless winter nights. But the moment the evening news crackled through the speaker, a report about some conflict in Central America, the usual litany of casualties and political posturing, the creature recoiled so violently it slammed against the far wall, its form flickering like a candle in a hurricane, and I watched in horror as it curled into itself with a sound I can only describe as keening. A frequency that made my teeth ache and my heart hammer against my ribs. I killed the radio immediately, plunging us back into silence, but the damage was done. My friend trembled for hours afterward, and when it finally looked at me again, those dark eyes held something I'd never seen there before. Not just fear, but a deep, ancient grief that seemed to carry the weight of civilizations. I tried to apologize, though I didn't understand what I was apologizing for, reaching out slowly the way I'd learned to do, and when it finally allowed me close enough to touch, I felt its whole body vibrating with what I recognized as terror, the kind that lives in your bones long after the immediate danger has passed. After that incident, I became hyper-aware of what I brought into the barn, carefully curating my own presence to avoid triggering that devastating response, but I couldn't always control what seeped through. On nights when I'd been to town and returned with newspapers, the creature would hang back, watching me with visible wariness as I entered, as though the very ink and paper carried contamination from the human world beyond our mountain sanctuary. I started noticing a pattern in what disturbed it most. Not just violence, but the casual way humans discussed violence, the normalized horror of our evening news where body counts were delivered in the same tone as weather reports, the photographs of weapons and walls and warfare that decorated even the most mundane publications. One evening, I made the mistake of bringing in a history book I'd owned since my teaching days, thinking perhaps I could use the illustrations to help us communicate, and the creature leafed through it with growing agitation until it reached the chapter on World War II, The photographs there, concentration camps, bombed cities, the mushroom cloud that ended it all, made it drop the book as though burned, and it backed away from me with its arms raised in a gesture that was unmistakably protective, defensive, as though I myself had become something dangerous simply by association with those images. I began to see myself and my species through my companion's eyes, and the view was devastating in its clarity. We were the monsters in this story, the unpredictable threat that could turn from kindness to cruelty in a heartbeat, capable of creating sublime art and systematic genocide with the same ingenious minds. The creature started responding to certain words with that telltale flinch, and I catalogued them like a reverse dictionary of human. Nature, war, weapon, kill, bomb, hate. But what disturbed me more were the words that should have been innocent, but somehow weren't. Nation, border, mine, enemy. Concepts so fundamental to human organization that I'd never questioned them. Yet each one made my friend retreat a little further into itself. I tried to show it the good things too, bringing pictures of children playing, families gathered for meals, acts of kindness and creation, but even those seemed tinged with sadness in its perception, as though it saw the potential for destruction lurking behind every human smile. One night, frustrated with this wall between us, I asked through our improvised signs why it was so afraid, what humanity had done to earn such profound distrust, and it looked at me with an expression of such complex emotion, pity and fear, and something almost like shame, before turning away without answering. The weight of being humanity's sole representative to this cosmic being pressed down on me with crushing force, and I found myself wanting desperately to defend my species, while simultaneously recognizing the truth in its fear. We were dangerous, catastrophically so, blessed and cursed, with hearts capable of infinite tenderness and infinite cruelty, often directed at the same beloved targets. I thought about my own life, the war I'd fought in that I never spoke about, the violence I'd both witnessed and committed in the name of causes that seemed righteous at the time, and I wondered if the creature could somehow sense that history in me, smell the old blood under my gentleness like a wolf scenting danger on the wind. Yet it stayed, despite its terror, despite every instinct that must have screamed at it to flee from the unpredictable human who brought food and kindness but belonged to a species that had clearly hurt it before. That choice, to remain despite fear, to trust despite evidence, became the foundation of something deeper between us, a bond forged not in innocence, but in the conscious decision to believe in the possibility of something different, something better than the patterns that had come before. The 25th winter arrived with a silence that felt different, heavier, as though the mountain itself was holding its breath, waiting for something inevitable. I was 73 years old by then, my hands gnarled as the oak roots that broke through the barn floor, and my companion had become as much a part of my daily existence as breathing. We'd developed our own language of gestures and drawings, and those strange harmonic sounds it made that I'd learned to interpret if not replicate. But on the night of our anniversary, the night I'd marked mentally as a quarter century since I'd first found it bleeding in my hay, the creature did something it had never done before. It spoke to me in English, halting and broken but unmistakably human words, shaped by a mouth not designed for them. Not accident, it said, the syllables painful and deliberate, each one sounding like it cost something to produce. I hiding, always hiding, not lost. I felt the foundation of our relationship shift beneath me like bedrock turning to sand, because in those few words lay the revelation that everything I'd assumed about our situation, that I was helping a stranded traveler, that I was performing an act of cosmic mercy, was built on a misunderstanding so fundamental it redrew the map of our entire history together. Over the following weeks, the truth emerged in fragments, painful as pulling shrapnel from old wounds, and I learned that my friend's presence on Earth was not the result of mechanical failure or navigational error, but deliberate exile, a self-imposed banishment driven by fear. "We watch you," it told me one night, the words coming easier now as though a dam had broken and everything it had held back for decades was finally flooding through. Long time. Many years, centuries, you say. Watch from far because coming close is... It paused, searching for the word, and finally settled on one that made my blood cold. Dangerous. I wanted to argue, to defend my species against this indictment, but the creature continued, with growing fluency, explaining that its kind had observed humanity through all our ages, the rise and fall of empires, the cycles of creation and destruction that marked our timeline like a violent heartbeat. You are most feared, it said simply, and those words hung in the frigid air between us like a pronouncement from some cosmic tribunal. Not because of machines or weapons, because you love wrong, love and kill, love and destroy, love and hurt, all the same, no stopping. The creature's assessment cut deeper than any criticism I'd ever heard, because it wasn't delivered with anger or judgment, only a kind of exhausted sorrow, the weariness of a species that had watched humanity from a safe distance and decided we were too volatile, too paradoxical, too beautifully broken to risk direct contact with. I tried to mount a defense of humanity, citing our art and music and moments of transcendent kindness. But even as the words left my mouth, they felt hollow, because I knew the evidence it was drawing from, the historical record that couldn't be argued away with appeals to our better nature. You build hospitals and bombs, it said, the observation clinical despite the broken grammar. Feed children, start wars, save life, take life, same hands, same hearts. We study you, try to understand, cannot. Most species choose path, grow gentle or die fighting. You do both, forever, all times. I thought about my own life then, the contradiction I embodied, a man who'd killed in a jungle on the other side of the world in the name of protecting freedom, who'd come home and chosen isolation because he couldn't reconcile the gentle person he believed himself to be with the terrible things those gentle hands had done. The creature was describing humanity's collective paradox, but it was also describing me, holding up a mirror that reflected not just my species, but my own damaged soul. "Why did you stay?" I finally asked, my voice rough with emotion I couldn't quite name. "If we're so dangerous, why not leave the moment you could?" It looked at me with those fathomless eyes and touched its chest, then mine, then made the gesture we'd developed over the years for the concept of connection, of chosen family. "Because you different," it said softly. "You could kill me easy. Never do, that is hope, you call it." The word hung between us like a fragile thing, and I understood then the immensity of what my companion had done, not just staying with me, but choosing every single day for 25 years to believe that I represented a possibility rather than a probability, that the kindness I showed was real and sustainable rather than a temporary mask over humanity's violent nature. "There are others?" I asked. The confirmation came not in words, but in action. The creature rose slowly and moved to the corner of the barn, where it kept the few possessions it had salvaged from whatever vessel had brought it here, a small collection of objects I'd learned not to examine too closely out of respect for its privacy. It returned carrying something wrapped in what looked like fabric, but moved like liquid, and when it unfolded the material, I saw what appeared to be a hide or skin, covered in markings that might have been writing or diagrams or something my human eyes couldn't properly categorize. But it wasn't the strange document that made my breath catch. It was what the creature did next, slowly removing the layered wrappings it always wore around its torso, revealing what I'd assumed was its natural form, but now understood was carefully hidden evidence. The scars were unmistakable once exposed to lamplight, running in brutal patterns across what I supposed was its chest and side. The tissue healed but distorted in ways that spoke of terrible trauma. These weren't the wounds I'd treated that first night, the injuries that had brought us together. These were older, deeper, deliberately inflicted. 1953, it said, the date clear despite its accent, and I felt time collapse between us because I'd been 9 years old in 1953, playing in creeks and dreaming of baseball while something unspeakable was being done to the being now standing vulnerable before me. The story emerged in painful fragments, its English failing under the weight of trauma, forcing it back into our improvised language of gestures and those haunting harmonic sounds that now carried an unmistakable tone of anguish. It had come before, decades before our encounter. Part of what I gathered was an observation mission, studying humanity from the edges of our awareness with what sounded like scientific curiosity, tempered by extreme caution. But it had been discovered, not by military or government as I might have expected, but by ordinary people, a farming family not unlike my own, living in what it indicated was somewhere in the American Midwest when I pressed for location. They were kind at first, it managed in English, the words clearly rehearsed as though it had prepared for this confession. Like you, give food, show gentleness. I think maybe the report's wrong about humans. Then its voice faltered, and it touched the worst of the scars, a twisted mass of tissue that looked like it had been burned and torn simultaneously. Then more humans come, different ones. They afraid, then angry, then... It made a gesture we'd developed for violence, for pain, and I didn't need words to understand what had happened next. The family that had initially shown kindness had either turned on it or been unable to protect it from others, and what followed was the kind of torture that humans excel at when confronted with something they fear and don't understand. Methodical, sustained, rationalized by that peculiar human capacity to dehumanize anything that doesn't fit our narrow definition of deserving compassion. I felt something break open inside. My chest, a complicated grief that was part shame for my species and part rage at what had been done to this gentle being who'd trusted the wrong humans at the wrong moment in history. 1953, the Korean War still bleeding, McCarthyism poisoning American discourse with paranoia, the Cold War teaching us all to see threats everywhere and respond with overwhelming force to anything we couldn't immediately categorize and control. How did you escape? I asked, though part of me didn't want to know, didn't want to hear what desperate measures it had been forced to take to survive human cruelty. Its response was a low, mournful sound that needed no translation, accompanied by a gesture that suggested others of its kind had intervened, extracted it at great risk, and the way it touched those old scars suggested the rescue had come almost too late. "They want me come home, never go back to Earth," it said, the English returning now that the worst of the story was told. "But I need to understand, need to know if all humans same, or if kindness was real before the fear." I understood then what I represented in its life, not just a companion or even a friend, but a test case, a decades-long experiment to determine whether the capacity for sustained gentleness existed in humanity, or whether we were all just one moment of fear away from becoming monsters. The weight of that responsibility should have crushed me, but instead it crystallized something I'd always suspected about connection, that every act of trust is a kind of courage, and every sustained relationship a choice to keep believing in someone's better nature, despite endless evidence that betrayal is always possible. "I'm sorry," I said, and the words felt microscopically inadequate for the magnitude of what had been done, but the creature made a gesture of acknowledgement, of hearing and accepting what I offered. "You not do it," it replied, touching my weathered hand with its strange three-fingered appendage. "But you are them, same species, same capable of same hurts. Every day I stay is choosing to believe you different, is hard choice, some days very hard." I thought about the mornings it had flinched when I moved too quickly, the way it positioned itself near exits, the subtle tension I'd attributed to its alien nature, but now recognized as hypervigilance born of trauma. My companion hadn't just been hiding from humanity in general, It had been recovering, processing, trying to reconcile the kindness it wanted to believe in with the vicious reality it had experienced, and I'd been part of that healing without even knowing the depth of the wound. "You've been afraid of me," I said, not a question, but a statement of fact, and it didn't deny it. "Every day, little bit. Afraid," it confirmed, "but every day you gentle, you patient, you good. Fear gets smaller. Not gone, never gone, but smaller. Maybe that is what love is for my kind. Choosing trust when fear say run." I wanted to defend us, to explain that humans were more than our worst moments, that we'd also created beauty and music and medicine and moments of breathtaking selflessness that surely counted for something in the cosmic ledger of worth. But the words died in my throat because I was looking at the evidence of what we'd done, scars that had been carried for 30 years across whatever impossible distance separated this being's home from mine, and my defense felt like asking the wounded to comfort the wounder. "We're not all like that," I finally managed, hearing how weak it sounded even as I spoke. "Those people who hurt you, they were afraid, ignorant. It was a different time." I stopped because the creature was making a sound I'd never heard before, something between its harmonic speech and what I horribly recognized as bitter laughter. "You make excuses," it said with a clarity of English that shocked me. "This is what humans do best. Make reasons why the hurt was necessary, was understandable, was someone else's fault. I watch your history, your wars, always same. Good reasons to do terrible things, and after, everyone say we not know better, or we were afraid, or they were different time." Its words hit like physical blows, because I'd used every one of those rationalizations myself, particularly about the war, about things I'd done in Vietnam that I'd spent 40 years explaining away as survival, as duty, as the unfortunate necessities of conflict. The creature wasn't just talking about the humans who tortured it. It was talking about me, about the comfortable lies I'd wrapped around my own capacity for violence. "Korea," I said suddenly, the word escaping before I could consider it, and the creature went very still in that particular way that meant I had its complete attention. "You said they hurt you in 1953, but you also said you watched our wars. Did you see Korea? Were you there observing when we—" I couldn't finish the question because I wasn't sure what I was asking or why it suddenly felt desperately important. My father had been in that war, had come home changed in ways my child self couldn't articulate, but felt in the distance that grew between us, the drinking, the nightmares, the way he'd flinch at loud noises for the rest of his abbreviated life. I'd grown up in the aftermath of what that war had done to him, and then I'd gone and done the same to myself in a different jungle, creating the same damage in a new generation, passing trauma down like a family heirloom. The creature moved, closer, and I saw something in its expression that might have been compassion or might have been the look you'd give a specimen that was finally revealing its true nature. "I was there," it confirmed quietly. "Watch from mountains as you bomb villages, burn crops, make choices you later say were necessary. Watch soldiers on both sides do things to prisoners, to civilians, things that make my hurting seem small. This why my people so afraid of yours, not because you special in cruelty, but because you so good at doing terrible things and then continuing, not destroyed by guilt, just carrying on." That hit something deep and true that I'd been avoiding for 50 years, the way I'd come home from Vietnam and just kept living, farming, existing, as though the things I'd participated in were just chapters in a book I could close and shelve. I'd never thought of it as a specifically human capability, that capacity to compartmentalize atrocity, to do unspeakable things on Tuesday and return to normalcy by Thursday, forever carrying the weight, but never being crushed by it the way a more sensitive species might be. "I killed people," I heard myself say, the confession emerging from some locked place I'd kept sealed since my return. "In the war, I killed people, and some of them might have been civilians, might have been wrong place or wrong intelligence or just wrong, and I knew it was wrong even while I was doing it, And then I came home and I just lived, planted corn, fixed fences, like it never happened. The creature didn't move, barely seemed to breathe, and I realized I was crying, tears cutting through the wrinkles of my 80-year-old face like rivers through ancient canyons. "How do you do that?" it asked. And there was genuine confusion in its voice, a scientist confronting data that didn't fit any theoretical model. "How you carry those memories and not die from the weight? My people, we feel too much. One serious moral injury, and we cannot continue. But humans, you stack them up like cordwood and keep walking." I didn't have an answer that would satisfy either of us, just the bleak understanding that maybe humanity's greatest survival trait was also our deepest flaw. We could adapt to anything, justify anything, survive anything, including the knowledge of our own monstrosity. The creature reached out and touched my face, where the tears fell, its strange fingers gentle against my weathered skin. And in that moment, I understood something it had been trying to tell me for years. It wasn't hiding from human technology or human violence in the abstract. It was hiding from human resilience, from our terrifying ability to inflict trauma and absorb trauma and just keep going, generation after generation, never quite learning, but never quite breaking either. "You not monster," it said finally, and I heard the effort those words cost, the choice to offer comfort despite its own pain. "But you capable of monstrous things, and you survive that capability. This what frightens us most. Not that you cruel, but that cruelty not destroy you. You just continue. Maybe love someone after killing someone. Maybe plant garden after burning village. You hold contradictions we cannot imagine." I sat there in the lamplight of my barn, with this wounded traveler from beyond the stars, both of us scarred by human capacity for violence, both of us trying to understand if connection was possible across that vast divide of experience, and I felt the weight of every choice that had led to this moment pressing down like the full gravity of all our accumulated history. The heart attack came on a February morning when I was feeding the chickens, a sudden vice grip around my chest that dropped me face first into the snow. I remember thinking with strange clarity that this was it, the end I'd been half expecting for years, and my next thought was for the creature alone in the barn, 40 years of hiding about to become meaningless because I'd failed to plan for this inevitable conclusion. I could see the barn from where I lay, its weathered boards grey against the white landscape, and I wondered if it would understand why I stopped coming, or if it would wait days before venturing out to discover my frozen body, and what choice it would make then: stay with my corpse, or finally flee to whatever safety it could find. The pain was enormous, radiating down my left arm and up into my jaw, and I felt my consciousness starting to fragment, breaking apart, like ice on a spring river. I don't know how long I lay there, seconds or minutes, time becoming elastic and strange, but then there were hands on me, impossibly strong, lifting me with desperate urgency, and I realized through the haze of agony that the creature had come out in full daylight, risking everything, carrying me toward the house. I tried to tell it to go back, to hide, that I wasn't worth this exposure, but no words would come. Just a wet, gurgling sound that terrified us both. Inside, it laid me on the kitchen floor, and I saw terror in its face, raw and absolute, the expression of someone watching their entire world collapse in real time. It was making sounds I'd never heard, high-pitched keening mixed with fragments of English, not die, please not die. And I understood that for 40 years I'd thought I was the one offering sanctuary when really we'd been saving each other, two damaged creatures hiding from our respective nightmares in this isolated pocket of mountain silence. Then its hands were on my chest, and I felt something like electricity or fire or pure light flowing from its palms into my failing heart, a sensation so intense it transcended pain and became something else entirely, like being unmade and reconstructed at the cellular level. I could feel my heart stuttering, stopping, then suddenly catching again, with a rhythm that felt wrong and then abruptly right, stronger than it had been in decades. The pain began receding like a tide going out, taking with it the numbness in my arm, the pressure in my chest, even the chronic ache in my joints that I'd carried since my 60s. I tried to speak, but the creature pressed harder, its face locked in fierce concentration, and I felt something fundamental shifting inside me, as though it was rewriting the basic code of my biology with desperate, improvised urgency. Light was emanating from where its hands touched me, visible even through my closed eyelids, a blue-white glow that seemed to fill the entire kitchen, and some distant part of my mind thought about windows, about neighbors miles away who might see this impossible illumination, about the risk it was taking for me. "Stop!" I managed to gasp out. "Too dangerous! They'll see! You have to stop!" But it either didn't hear or didn't care. Its entire being focused on the act of pulling me back from whatever darkness I'd been sliding toward. I could hear it speaking in its own language now, words that sounded like music and mathematics combined, like it was negotiating with my body at a molecular level, convincing my cells to remember how to function properly. The light grew brighter, painfully intense, and I thought about all those stories of alien abductions, the descriptions of blinding illumination and inexplicable healing, and realized with shock that somewhere out there might be other humans who'd experienced this, who'd been touched by this same desperate mercy and never found a way to explain it. Then suddenly it was over, the light winking out like a blown bulb, and the creature collapsed beside me on the kitchen floor, its chest heaving with exhaustion or perhaps something more like despair. I lay there breathing, each inhalation a small miracle, my heart beating with a steady strength I hadn't felt in years, maybe decades. When I finally found the strength to turn my head, I saw it staring at the ceiling with an expression of absolute devastation, and I understood what it had done, what this act had cost. "They'll know now," it whispered, the English coming easier than ever before, as though the healing had somehow completed a circuit between us. "My people, they monitor for this kind of energy signature. They know now someone here is using our technology, our knowledge, on this planet we're supposed to be only observing. And if they know, maybe your people know too, maybe your satellites or sensors caught something they cannot explain, and they will come looking." I reached out and took its hand, our fingers intertwining in a gesture we'd developed over 40 years, human and other, both of us now fugitives from different kinds of authority. "Then we face it together," I said, my voice stronger than it had been moments ago when I'd been dying in the snow. "You saved me, and I don't know what happens next, but whatever it is, we face it together. You understand?" It turned to look at me, and I saw tears in its eyes, those two large eyes that had watched humanity's worst moments, and somehow still found enough hope to risk everything for one old farmer's life. We stayed there on the kitchen floor as the morning light strengthened, two beings from different worlds clinging to each other in the aftermath of a choice that couldn't be undone. I could feel the difference in my body, the unnatural vitality humming through my veins, and knew that I'd been fundamentally changed, that whatever it had done hadn't just fixed my heart, but altered something deeper, buying me time I had no right to expect. 40 years you waited," I said finally, piecing together the truth I'd been avoiding. "You could have left any time, could have signaled your people or found some way home, but you stayed. Because you were waiting for me to die naturally, weren't you? So you could leave without guilt, without feeling like you'd abandoned me." It made that sound that might have been laughter or sobbing, and I felt its grip tighten on my hand. "I was afraid," it admitted. "Afraid to trust, afraid to care, afraid that if I let myself love you the way you loved me, it would hurt too much when humans inevitably did what humans do. Disappoint, betray, destroy. Easier to wait, to keep distance, to tell self I was prisoner of circumstance, rather than admit I was choosing to stay." The words hung between us, confession and accusation and forgiveness all braided together, and I realized we'd both been Prisoners, both been hiding, both been too afraid of vulnerability to name what these 40 years had actually meant. "I'm not going anywhere now," I said, feeling the truth of it in my restored heartbeat. "And apparently neither are you. So I guess we're stuck with each other. No more excuses, no more waiting for the easy ending." It laughed. Then really laughed, the sound so startlingly human that for a moment the differences between us seemed meaningless. Just two old souls who'd found each other in the darkness and decided, against all reason and survival instinct, that connection was worth the inevitable cost of loss. We spent the next 3 days waiting for consequences that never came, listening for helicopters or watching for black vehicles on the mountain road, but the world remained stubbornly ordinary, as though the universe had decided to grant us a temporary reprieve. The creature moved through the house freely now, no longer confined to the barn, and I marveled at how quickly the impossible became routine. This, being sitting at my kitchen table, learning to make coffee, standing at the window watching snow fall with an expression of wonder I'd somehow never noticed before. It told me about the healing, how it had used something called cellular resonance to reset my body's degradation patterns, essentially turning back my biological clock by 2 decades, and that the energy signature would have appeared on monitoring systems like a brief, inexplicable flash, easily dismissed as instrument error or natural phenomenon. "But your people will know," it insisted. "They always know when one of us breaks the observation protocols, even if your human authorities miss it. My kind will have questions I cannot answer without revealing where I am, who I helped, why I chose to interfere." I watched it struggle with this burden, the weight of defying its entire species' foundational rule, and felt something shift in how I understood courage. Not the battlefield bravery I'd known in my youth, but this quieter kind, the choice to save rather than preserve yourself, to act despite perfect awareness of the cost. We were both exiles now, I realized, both traitors to our respective kinds for the simple crime of refusing to let fear dictate love's boundaries. On the 4th day, it showed me something it had kept hidden even through our decades together, reaching into a cavity in the barn wall to retrieve a small device that pulsed with faint light. "This is how I could have called them," it explained, holding the object with something like reverence or regret. "Any time in 40 years, I press this sequence and a ship comes within weeks, takes me home, erases all evidence I was ever here." The device looked organic and technological, simultaneously like a living thing bred for purpose. And I understood I was seeing something no human was meant to witness. Technology so advanced, it bypassed our entire framework of understanding. "Why didn't you?" I asked, though I thought I knew the answer, needed to hear it spoken aloud, made real through words. It turned the device over in its long fingers, and when it spoke, the English was perfect, all awkwardness finally abandoned. At first, pure fear. I thought if they came, they'd see what humans did to me before, judge me as compromised, possibly eliminate me to prevent contamination of the observation protocols. Then later, I told myself I was studying you, that our interaction was valuable research, giving me insights into human behavior my people needed. But the truth, Thomas, the real truth I've been avoiding for decades, is that I stayed because for the first time in my entire existence, I wasn't lonely, and I couldn't bear to go back to a life where connection was forbidden and caring was considered a dangerous weakness. Hearing my name in its voice, spoken with such careful emotion, broke something open in my chest, and I realized we'd spent 40 years dancing around this simple fact, that love didn't require the same biology, just the willingness to see another being's soul and decide it mattered more than safety. That night, sitting in my living room with the wood stove crackling and snow tapping against the windows, it asked me about my war, the trauma I'd spent 60 years trying to forget. I told it things I'd never spoken aloud, about the village we'd burned, the faces that still visited my dreams, the way I'd come to these mountains to hide from myself as much as from judgment, seeking isolation as penance for actions I couldn't undo or justify. Your people aren't wrong to fear us, I admitted, feeling the old shame rise up despite decades of attempted burial. We are dangerous. We do love and destroy with the same hands, and I don't know if that makes us evil or just broken or something more complicated than simple. Categorization. The creature listened without interruption, and when I finished, it showed me its scars again, but this time told the full story, how it had tried to make contact with a human researcher in 1952, offering knowledge, seeking dialogue, and how that human had responded with violence born of pure terror, capturing and experimenting on it for 6 months before it managed to escape. I hated your entire species for decades after, it confessed, saw you as monsters without exception, and told myself the observation protocols existed because humans were too primitive, too dangerous to be trusted with knowledge of other conscious life. We sat in silence, two beings carrying the weight of our species' worst impulses, both damaged by humanity's capacity for fear-driven cruelty, and yet somehow still sitting together, still choosing connection, despite every rational reason to retreat into isolated safety. Maybe that's what courage actually is, I said finally, voicing the thought that had been forming through days of revelation and recovery, not the absence of fear or the denial of danger, but the choice to trust anyway, to stay vulnerable even when you know exactly how badly it can end, to love despite perfect understanding that love makes you breakable. The creature set down the recall device on the table between us, and in that gesture I saw the final release of 40 years of escape planning, the choice to stop waiting for my death as permission to leave. My people believe detachment is wisdom, it said softly, that caring about those we observe compromises our ability to understand them objectively. But they're wrong, Thomas, because you can't truly understand a species without risking connection, without making yourself vulnerable to their pain and beauty and terrible contradictory nature. Outside, the snow had stopped, and through the window I could see stars emerging in the clearing sky, billions of points of light, each one potentially home to beings like my friend, all of them maintaining their distant observation, their careful non-interference, their safe isolation from the dangerous, beautiful mess of actual relationship. We could call them, I offered, knowing even as I spoke that neither of us would choose that ending. Tell them you're injured, need extraction, let you go home. But it shook its head, those large eyes reflecting the firelight, and reached out to take my hand in a grip that had become familiar as my own heartbeat. I am home, it said simply, and in those 3 words lay a truth bigger than species or protocol or fear, the recognition that home was never a place, but always the presence of whoever saw you clearly and loved you anyway, whoever made the unbearable weight of consciousness feel less like burden and more like gift. We lived another 15 years in that house on the mountain, and they were the quietest, fullest years of my long life, marked not by grand events, but by the profound ordinariness of 2 beings learning to share existence across the unbridgeable gap of biology and origin. The creature, though I'd long since started thinking of it by the name it finally offered, a sound I could only approximate as Eris, slowly transformed the property, coaxing strange plants from seeds it had preserved since its arrival, filling the greenhouse with flowers that bloomed in colors I had no names for, creating a small sanctuary of its distant world here. On my Appalachian hillside, we established routines that felt almost domestic: morning coffee while watching sunrise, afternoons spent in comfortable silence with books or simply sitting, evenings filled with conversation that ranged from quantum mechanics to the nature of consciousness to why humans found certain chord progressions emotionally devastating. Occasionally hikers would pass near the property, and Eris would vanish into carefully prepared hiding spots, and each time it emerged after they'd gone, I saw the old fear still present but diminished, worn down by years of safety, by the evidence that perhaps isolation wasn't the only path to survival. We were writing a new story, I realized, one being at a time, proving that the gap between species was crossable if both parties were willing to build the bridge, step by uncertain step, toward understanding that transcended the limitations of language or form. In 2024, when I was technically 103 years old, but felt like a vigorous 80 thanks to Eris's intervention, we received an unexpected visitor, not a government agent or curious neighbor, but another of Eris's kind, who appeared one autumn evening standing at the edge of the tree line, making no attempt at concealment. I felt Eris go rigid beside me on the porch. Decades of carefully maintained anonymity suddenly shattered and understood. We were finally facing the consequences it had anticipated for so long, the reckoning that came from choosing love over protocol. The visitor approached slowly, and I noticed it moved with authority, with purpose. And when it spoke, Eris translated in a shaking voice, "This is an arbiter, one who enforces the observation laws. They've come to investigate the energy signature from my healing you, to determine if I've compromised the study and whether I need to be removed." We invited the arbiter inside. What else could we do? And it spent 3 days observing our life, watching how we interacted, asking questions through Eris about our history, our bond, our understanding of what we'd built together. I couldn't read its expressions, didn't know if we were being judged or studied or condemned, but I answered every question with complete honesty, defending nothing, simply offering the truth that sometimes love arrives in unexpected forms, and the only real mistake is turning away from it because it doesn't match your expectations of how connection should look. On the 4th day, the arbiter delivered its judgment in Eris's language, and I watched my friend's face transform through a sequence of emotions I'd learned to read over 40 years. Shock, disbelief, something that looked remarkably like hope. "They're not here to remove me," Eris translated slowly, as though testing the words for hidden traps. "They're here to document us, because there are others, Thomas, dozens of us across your world who have formed attachments to individual humans, who have been hiding these connections, living in fear of discovery and punishment, and the arbiters have been conducting a review of the protocols, questioning whether our doctrine of detachment is actually wisdom or just fear masquerading as policy. The arbiter produced a device and recorded us for hours, asked me to explain human concepts like friendship, loyalty, trust, and why I'd risked everything to protect a being I had every reason to fear. I told them what I'd learned in my long life, that fear and love aren't opposites but twins, that courage means acting despite terror, that the greatest discoveries come from stepping toward the unknown rather than retreating into familiar safety. When the arbiter finally left, it told Eris through gestures we both understood that our story would be shared with their people, that we were evidence in a growing argument that consciousness demanded connection, that true understanding required vulnerability, that perhaps humanity wasn't too dangerous to know, but too important to keep hidden from, because only in relationship could anyone, human or otherwise, learn to transcend their worst impulses toward their highest possibilities. Eris and I lived 7 more years after the arbiter's visit, and in that time 3 other human visitor pairs came to meet us, brought by intermediaries, seeking evidence that they weren't alone in their impossible love, their cross-species bonds that defied every protocol and logic. We became a kind of sanctuary for the lost and connected, proof that the universe was larger and stranger and more accommodating than anyone's rules suggested, and I understood that my isolated mountain had transformed into something I'd never imagined, a place where 2 worlds met, not through invasion or observation, but through the simple, radical act of beings choosing to see each other as equally worthy of care. When I finally died at 110, peacefully in my sleep with Eris holding my hand, I went knowing that our 42 years together had rippled outward in ways that would long outlast my brief human span, that we'd helped shift an entire species' understanding of what wisdom meant, that sometimes the most profound revolutions begin not with violence or grand proclamations, but with one frightened being in a barn and one lonely human deciding that compassion mattered more than fear. Eris buried me on the hillside overlooking the valley, planted one of those nameless flowers over my grave, and chose to stay in our house, continuing to live half-hidden but no longer alone, visited by others of its kind who were learning slowly, painfully, beautifully, that love was never the weakness they'd been taught to avoid, but the strength that made consciousness worth bearing. In the end, we taught each other the same lesson from opposite directions, that being dangerous and being worthy of trust aren't contradictions, that fear is just love's protective armor, and that true courage lies not in eliminating risk, but in staying open despite it, in building bridges across impossible distances, in choosing again and again to believe that connection matters more than safety, that understanding matters more than judgment, and that sometimes the greatest act of faith is simply staying when every instinct screams to run. What would you risk to connect with someone completely different from yourself? Subscribe to hear more stories that challenge everything you thought you knew about what it means to be human.